I'm Emma Chen, and for 26 years I've been living as the family's hidden secret. Not because of anything I did wrong, but because of 3-inch scar that runs from my left temple down to my jaw, a permanent reminder of the day I pushed my older brother Marcus out of the way of a falling ladder when I was 8 years old. That accident saved his life but left me with what my mother calls my unfortunate appearance. When they told me I couldn't attend Marcus's wedding because I'd ruined the professional photographs, I realized they'd rather have a perfect picture than their own daughter present. But what they didn't know was that their flawed daughter was about to show them exactly what happens when you mistake someone's worth for their appearance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the dusty windows of Chen's Hardware and Garden Center in Cedar Falls, Iowa, as I arranged the spring fertilizer display for the third time this week. My parents, Linda and Robert Chen, had owned this store for 23 years, watching it slowly decline as big box retailers moved into our small Midwest town. The wooden floors creaked under my feet as I worked, the same sound I'd heard every day after school since I was 12, when I started helping out instead of joining clubs or making friends like other kids my age. Marcus breezed through the front door at exactly 9:30, just like he had every Tuesday for the past month, wearing his perfectly pressed suit and that confident smile that had charmed everyone in Cedar Falls since high school. At 29, he was everything our parents had ever wanted in a son. Successful attorney, handsome, engaged to Sarah Mitchell, the daughter of the town's most prominent real estate developer, and most importantly, unmarked by any visible flaws that might embarrass the family. "Morning, Emma," he said, barely glancing at me as he headed straight for the office where our parents were reviewing invoices. I watched him disappear behind the door marked management only, a door I'd never been invited to enter despite having spent the last 8 years pulling this place back from bankruptcy with my graphic design and social media skills. Linda emerged from the office 30 minutes later, her graying hair pulled back in the same tight bun she'd worn for as long as I could remember. She surveyed my fertilizer display with the critical eye she reserved specifically for my work, tilting her head slightly, as if trying to find something wrong with the perfectly organized bags. "The wedding planning meeting is tonight," she announced, not bothering to look directly at me. "Sarah's photographer wants to discuss the family photo arrangements." She paused, her fingers drumming against the counter in that nervous way that always preceded bad news. "We need to talk about your role in the ceremony." My stomach tightened, but I kept my voice steady. "Of course. I've been looking forward to it." This wasn't entirely true. I'd been dreading the wedding for months, knowing it would be another event where I'd be relegated to the background while Marcus basked in everyone's attention. But he was my brother, and despite everything, I wanted to be there for what was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. Robert joined us from the office, his weathered hands still stained with the morning's inventory work. He'd always been a man of few words, preferring to let Linda handle what he called the emotional stuff. But the look he gave me now was heavy with something I couldn't quite identify: pity, maybe, or resignation. "The photographer is very expensive," he said slowly, as if choosing each word carefully. "Sarah's family is paying for him to come all the way from Chicago. He specializes in perfect wedding photography." The way he emphasized the word perfect made my scar burn with phantom pain. I knew where this conversation was heading, but I forced myself to wait, to let them say the words that would finally reveal what they truly thought of their daughter. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, broken only by the distant sound of Marcus's laughter echoing from the office. Linda cleared her throat and finally met my eyes, her expression a carefully constructed mask of maternal concern. "Emma, honey, we've been thinking about the wedding photos. You know how important they are to Sarah's family. These pictures will be displayed in their home for years, passed down to future generations. We need them to be She trailed off, gesturing vaguely at my face. To be what, Mom? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Unblemished, Robert finished quietly. The photographer explained that your scar would be very difficult to edit out of group photos without making them look artificial. Sarah's been dreaming of perfect wedding photos since she was a little girl. The words hit me like ice water, but I kept my expression neutral. I'd learned long ago not to show them how deeply their casual cruelty could cut. So what are you saying exactly? Marcus appeared in the office doorway, having clearly heard every word. Unlike our parents, he had the decency to look uncomfortable, but he didn't speak up in my defense. He never did. We think it would be best if you didn't attend the ceremony, Linda said, her voice taking on that artificially sweet tone she used when delivering devastating news. You could help with setup in the morning, then leave before the photographer arrives. We'll make sure you get a nice dinner from the caterer as a thank you for all your help. The casual dismissal in her voice, the way she reduced my presence at my own brother's wedding to a catering consolation prize, finally broke through my practiced composure. You're uninviting me from Marcus's wedding because you think I'll ruin the photos. It's not about ruining anything, Robert said, though his inability to maintain eye contact suggested otherwise. It's about what's best for everyone involved. Sarah's family has very high standards, and this day needs to be perfect for her. I looked at Marcus, waiting for him to say something, anything, that might indicate he disagreed with this decision. But he just stood there, adjusting his tie the way he always did when he was uncomfortable, but unwilling to take a stand. The brother I'd saved from serious injury, possibly death, couldn't even find the courage to speak up for my right to attend his wedding. I see, I said finally, my voice surprisingly steady. And what about what's best for me? What about the fact that I'm your daughter, your sister? Doesn't that count for anything? Linda's expression hardened, the artificial sweetness evaporating. Don't be dramatic, Emma. You're 26 years old. It's time you learned that life isn't always fair, and sometimes we have to make sacrifices for the good of the family. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd been making sacrifices for this family my entire life, starting with the physical sacrifice that left me scarred, and continuing through every opportunity I'd given up to keep their business afloat. But apparently, the one sacrifice I couldn't make was existing visibly in their perfect family portrait. Fine, I said, turning back to my fertilizer display. I understand completely, but as I arranged those bags for the fourth time, my mind was already working, calculating, planning. They wanted perfection. They were about to learn that perfection was a very fragile thing, and I was tired of being the family's dirty little secret. That evening, I sat in the back corner of Mel's Diner, our town's only restaurant that stayed open past 8 o'clock, waiting for my best friend Jake Rodriguez to finish.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Finish his shift at the fire station. The red vinyl booth was cracked and patched with duct tape, but it had become our usual meeting spot whenever I needed to talk through another family crisis. Jake had been my closest friend since high school, one of the few people in Cedar Falls who'd never made me feel like my scar defined me. When he finally arrived, still wearing his uniform shirt with soot stains on the sleeves, he took one look at my face and immediately flagged down the waitress for coffee. Okay, what did they do this time? I told him everything, watching his expression shift from disbelief to anger as I described the conversation at the store. Jake had always been protective of me, probably because he understood what it felt like to be different in a small town. His family had been the only Latino family in Cedar Falls for most of his childhood, and he'd endured his share of casual prejudice and exclusion. They actually uninvited you from your own brother's wedding, he said, shaking his head in disgust. That's not just cruel, it's insane. You saved Marcus's life. That scar represents the most selfless thing an 8-year-old could do, and they're treating it like some kind of shameful secret. I stirred my coffee slowly, watching the cream swirl into pale brown spirals. The worst part is that I'm not even surprised. I've been preparing for this my whole life, you know. Every family photo where they positioned me in the back, every school event where they found an excuse not to attend, every time they introduced Marcus as their pride and joy while barely acknowledging I existed. You don't have to accept this, Jake said firmly. There has to be something you can do. Like what? Storm the wedding and ruin Sarah's perfect day. That would just prove their point. I laughed bitterly. Besides, maybe they're right. Maybe I would ruin the photos. Maybe it's better for everyone if I just disappear. Jake reached across the table and grabbed my hand, his grip warm and reassuring. Don't you dare let them convince you that you're less valuable because of a scar. Emma, you're the most talented, generous, hard-working person I know. You've single-handedly kept their business from going under with your marketing campaigns. You designed their entire website, managed their social media, created all their promotional materials. Without you, Chen's Hardware would have closed 5 years ago. He was right, of course. When the store started losing customers to the new Home Depot on the outskirts of town, I'd convinced my parents to let me revamp their marketing strategy. I'd created a social media presence that highlighted their personal service and local expertise, designed eye-catching flyers for seasonal promotions, and even started a DIY blog that drove traffic to their store. Within 2 years, their revenue had increased by 40%, and they'd paid off the loans that had been threatening to bankrupt them. But none of that seemed to matter when it came to family photos. I've been thinking about leaving Cedar Falls, I admitted quietly. I have enough money saved up from my freelance design work to start over somewhere else. Somewhere nobody knows about my family or their expectations. Jake nodded slowly. Maybe that's exactly what you need. You've spent your whole life trying to earn their approval, Emma. But some people are never going to see your worth, no matter what you do. Maybe it's time to find people who will. As I drove home that night, through the empty streets of Cedar Falls, past the grain elevator and the railroad tracks that divided our town into the right side and the wrong side, I thought about Jake's words. I'd spent 18 years living in my parents' house, then 8 more years working in their store, all while building a freelance design business on the side. I had clients in 3 different states who valued my work and paid me well for it. I had skills that were in demand in bigger cities with more opportunities. The only thing keeping me in Cedar Falls was the hope that someday my family would see me as more than a damaged daughter who needed to be hidden away, but today had finally shown me the truth I'd been avoiding. They would never see me differently because they didn't want to. It was easier for them to maintain their perfect family illusion by pretending I didn't exist. My apartment above the old pharmacy on Main Street felt smaller than usual as I climbed the narrow stairs, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I'd rented this place right after college, telling myself it was temporary, just until I figured out my next move. But temporary had stretched into 4 years, and I'd never bothered to make it feel like home. The walls were still the landlord's beige, decorated with a few framed prints I'd picked up at garage sales. My furniture was a mismatched collection of hand-me-downs and thrift store finds. Looking around at this space I'd never really inhabited, I realized it was the perfect metaphor for my entire life in Cedar Falls. I'd been living in the margins, making do with whatever scraps of affection and attention my family was willing to throw my way, never demanding more because I was afraid of losing even that. But what exactly would I be losing? A family that was ashamed of me, a business that exploited my talents while denying me any real authority, a town where I'd always be known as the Chen girl with the scarred face. I opened my laptop and started browsing apartment listings in Portland, Oregon. I'd always been drawn to the Pacific Northwest, attracted by photos of the mountains and forests, the creative communities, the coffee culture, the emphasis on individuality over conformity. Portland seemed like the kind of place where a scar might be seen as a mark of character rather than a flaw to be hidden. As I scrolled through photos of bright, modern apartments in neighborhoods with names like Hawthorne and Alberta, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of earning my family's approval, but the quiet, steady hope of building something new for myself. By midnight, I'd filled out 3 rental applications and started a list of everything I'd need to do to make this move happen. Cancel my lease, pack my belongings, transfer my freelance client relationships, find new clients in Portland, research the job market for graphic designers. It felt overwhelming and terrifying and absolutely necessary. The wedding was still 6 weeks away, 6 weeks to plan my escape from a life that had never really fit me anyway. 6 weeks to build the courage to choose myself over my family's comfort. 6 weeks to prove that sometimes the best response to being uninvited is to throw your own party somewhere else entirely. I closed my laptop and looked out my window at the sleeping town below, at the streets I'd walked my entire life, at the place that had shaped me but never really accepted me. For the first time since I was 8 years old, I felt truly free to make my own choices about my future. Tomorrow, I would start planning my exit strategy. But tonight, I would let myself imagine what it might feel like to live somewhere where my worth wasn't measured by my appearance, where my talents were appreciated, where I could be seen as whole rather than damaged. It was the best night's sleep I'd had in years. Parts 2, 5. The toxic pattern and backstory. The next morning brought the familiar routine of opening Chen's Hardware and Garden Center, but everything felt different now that I'd made my decision to leave. I arrived early, as I had every day for the past 8 years, unlocking the heavy glass door and flipping on the fluorescent lights that hummed and flickered before settling into their harsh white glow. The store smelled of fertilizer, paint, and the musty dampness that seemed to seep into every old building in Cedar Falls during the spring months. Marcus wouldn't arrive until 10, and our parents typically showed up around 9, which gave me an hour alone with my thoughts and the familiar comfort of organizing inventory. But today, instead of finding peace in the routine, I felt like I was saying goodbye to a life that had never really been mine to begin with. Every shelf I straightened, every price tag I adjusted, every display I perfected felt like one more piece of evidence that I'd been wasting my talents on people who would never appreciate them. The bell above the door chimed at exactly 9 o'clock, announcing Linda's arrival with her usual punctuality. She carried her oversized leather purse and a steaming cup of coffee from the gas station down the street, never bothering to make coffee at the store, despite having a perfectly functional machine in the office. Her routine was as predictable as the sunrise: check the register, review yesterday's sales figures, walk through the store looking for problems that didn't exist, then settle into the office to make phone calls to suppliers who had learned to screen her calls. "Good morning, Emma," she said without looking at me, her voice carrying that particular tone of forced politeness she used when she was still processing our conversation from the day before. She knew she'd hurt me, but she also knew I wouldn't make a scene about it. I'd trained my family well over the years, always swallowing my pain to keep their world comfortable and conflict-free. Robert arrived 20 minutes later, his work boots heavy on the wooden floors as he made his way to the back office. He'd been getting up at 5:30 every morning for as long as I could remember, working construction jobs before the store opened to supplement their income. His hands were permanently stained with paint and caul used from decades of manual labor, and he moved with the careful precision of a man whose body had been worn down by years of hard work. "Morning, kiddo," he said, using the childhood nickname he'd never bothered to update despite the fact that I was 26 years old and had been managing half their business operations for almost a decade. It was easier for him to see me as a perpetual child than to acknowledge that I'd grown into a capable adult whose contributions kept their dreams alive. I watched them disappear into the office, heard the familiar sound of Linda's voice rising and falling as she reviewed the day's agenda, saw Robert settle into his worn leather chair with the day's invoices spread across his desk. This was their domain, the space where all the real decisions were made, where the future of Chen's hardware was discussed and planned without any input from the person who had single-handedly saved it from bankruptcy. The morning passed slowly, punctuated by the occasional customer looking for gardening supplies or asking questions about spring maintenance projects. I helped an elderly woman choose the right fertilizer for her tomato garden, explained the difference between interior and exterior paint to a young couple fixing up their first home, and walked a contractor through our selection of power tools. Each interaction reminded me of why I'd originally enjoyed working at the store, how satisfying it felt to solve problems and share knowledge, to be genuinely helpful in ways that mattered. But it also reminded me of how invisible my expertise had become to my own family. Customers often asked to speak with the owner about complex projects, and Linda or Robert would emerge from the office to repeat information I'd already provided, taking credit for knowledge I'd gained through research and experience. They'd nod along as if they'd discovered these solutions themselves, while I restocked shelves in the background like hired help. When Marcus finally arrived, he brought with him the energy of someone whose biggest concern was choosing between the salmon and the chicken for his wedding reception. His suit was immaculate, his smile practiced and professional, his entire demeanor radiating the confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. He greeted me with a casual wave before heading straight to the office, where I could hear him launching into an animated discussion about wedding planning with our parents. "The country club is absolutely perfect," his voice carried through the thin walls. "Sarah's photographer got the lighting permits for the ceremony, and we've confirmed the string quartet for the cocktail hour. Everything is coming together exactly as planned." I continued pricing merchandise while listening to them discuss flowers and centerpieces, menu selections and seating arrangements, all the details of a celebration that would supposedly represent our family's joy and unity, while deliberately excluding one of its members. They talked about the wedding as if it were a business presentation, focused entirely on logistics and appearances, rather than the actual meaning of the commitment Marcus was making. "The photographer wants to do family portraits right after the ceremony," Linda's voice drifted through the door. "He said the lighting will be perfect around 4 o'clock, and Sarah wants to get all the formal photos done before the reception starts." "That sounds ideal," Robert agreed. "We'll have plenty of time to get good shots of everyone who matters." Everyone who matters. The phrase hit me like a physical blow, but I kept my hands steady as I continued my work. This was exactly the kind of casual cruelty that had defined my relationship with my family for years, the thoughtless comments that revealed how they really saw me. I wasn't someone who mattered. I was someone whose absence would actually improve their precious photographs. The lunch rush brought a steady stream of customers, mostly contractors and homeowners working on spring projects. I helped them load mulch and lumber, answered questions about paint coverage and tool rentals, processed payments and provided receipts. For 2 hours, I was too busy to think about weddings, or family dynamics, or the growing list of preparations I needed to make for my move to Portland. But when the store finally quieted down, I found myself alone with Marcus while our parents took their usual lunch break at the diner down the street. He was restocking the key-cutting machine, a task that required just enough attention to provide a convenient excuse for avoiding eye contact during difficult conversations. "So," he said, without looking up from the key blanks, "Mom told me you're okay with missing the ceremony. I think that's really mature of you, Emma. It shows you understand what's important." The casual assumption in his voice, the way he framed my forced exclusion as a generous gesture on my part, finally pushed me past the point of polite silence. "I'm not okay with it, Marcus. I'm hurt and angry and disappointed. But I understand that my feelings don't matter as much as your perfect wedding photos." He finally looked at me, his expression showing the uncomfortable surprise of someone who wasn't used to hearing honest emotions from people he'd taken for granted. "It's not about your feelings not mattering, it's about being practical. Sarah's family is paying for an expensive photographer, and they want certain kinds of pictures. You have to understand their perspective. Their perspective is that I'm too ugly to be in their family photos, I said flatly. And your perspective is apparently that this is reasonable. Marcus set down the key he was holding and turned to face me fully for the first time in months. Emma, don't be dramatic. It's not about you being ugly, it's about the photos looking professional and polished. Every family has to make compromises for these big events. Really, tell me about the compromises you're making, Marcus. What are you giving up for the sake of family harmony? What dreams are you setting aside to make everyone else comfortable? I kept my voice level, but I could feel years of suppressed frustration building behind every word. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly realizing that he had no answer. Marcus had never been asked to compromise anything significant for anyone. He'd been supported through law school, celebrated for every achievement, welcomed into every family gathering and social event. His needs and wants had always been treated as the family's top priority. That's different, he said finally. I'm getting married, this is supposed to be the happiest day of my life. And I'm your sister, I replied. Isn't my presence supposed to be part of what makes you happy? The question hung in the air between us, unanswered and unanswerable. We both knew the truth. My presence had never made him particularly happy because he'd never seen me as essential to his life or his celebrations. I was the convenient helper who managed details behind the scenes, not the cherished family member whose absence would leave a genuine hole in his special day. That afternoon, while my parents were busy with paperwork and Marcus had left for a meeting with his wedding planner, I found myself alone in the store's office for the first time in years. The space was cramped and cluttered, filled with filing cabinets, sample books, and decades' worth of accumulated business materials. But what struck me most was how little evidence there was of my contributions to the store's success. The walls were covered with awards and certificates of appreciation, mostly addressed to Robert Chen, or Chen's Hardware and Garden Center in general. There were photos of my parents with local business leaders, newspaper clippings about community events the store had sponsored, and thank you letters from satisfied customers. But nowhere was there any acknowledgement of the marketing campaigns that had transformed their struggling business into a profitable enterprise. I pulled up the store's website on the office computer, the site I'd designed and maintained for the past 5 years. Every page reflected my understanding of their customers' needs, my eye for visual design, my ability to translate technical information into accessible language. The blog section showcased dozens of DIY tutorials I'd written, seasonal guides I'd researched, and project galleries I'd photographed and curated. The social media integration displayed testimonials from customers who had found solutions to their problems through my online content. This website had been directly responsible for bringing in hundreds of new customers and thousands of dollars in additional revenue. But if someone asked my parents how their business had turned around, they would credit their superior customer service, their competitive pricing, their deep knowledge of local needs. They might mention, almost as an afterthought, that Emma had helped with some computer stuff. I opened the store's financial records, something I'd been tracking since I convinced them to let me implement new accounting software 3 years ago. The numbers told a clear story of transformation: revenue up 43%, profit margins improved by 30%, customer retention increased by 57%. These weren't abstract statistics, they represented real changes that had allowed my parents to pay off their debts, upgrade their inventory, and maintain their independence in an increasingly competitive market. But none of that would matter when they told the story of their business success. I would remain the invisible force behind their transformation, the uncredited ghostwriter of their professional redemption. As I sat in that cluttered office, surrounded by evidence of my family's selective blindness, I thought about the conversation I'd overheard earlier about people who matter. It occurred to me that I had spent my entire adult life trying to prove I mattered to people who had already decided I didn't. I had been performing an elaborate audition for a role that was never available to me, competing in a contest where the rules were designed to ensure my failure. The realization was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant acknowledging that my parents and brother would probably never see me the way I desperately wanted them to. Liberating because it meant I could stop trying to earn something that was never going to be offered freely. That evening, I stayed late at the store to work on a new promotional campaign for their summer lawn care products, partly because the work genuinely needed to be done, and partly because I wanted to avoid going home to my empty apartment, where I would spend the night researching Portland neighborhoods and imagining my future life. The store was peaceful after hours, with only the distant hum of the refrigeration units and the occasional creak of the old building settling into the night. I was deep into designing flyers for their annual spring sale when I heard the back door open and close, followed by familiar footsteps crossing the storage area. Jake appeared in the doorway of the office, still wearing his work clothes from his evening shift at the fire station. "I figured I'd find you here," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "You always work late when you're trying to avoid thinking about something." "I'm not avoiding anything," I said, though we both knew that wasn't true. "I'm just trying to get caught up on some projects before." I trailed off, realizing I hadn't actually told him about my decision to leave Cedar Falls. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Before what?" I saved my work and closed the laptop, then turned to face him fully. "Before I move to Portland. I've been looking at apartments online, and I think I'm going to do it. Leave Cedar Falls, start over somewhere completely new." His expression shifted from surprise to something that looked like relief. "Good," he said simply. "It's about time. You're not going to try to talk me out of it?" I asked. "Tell me I'm being rash or running away from my problems." Jake shook his head. "Emma, I've been watching you kill yourself trying to make these people happy for years. You've given them everything you have, and they still treat you like you're lucky to be included at all. Moving away isn't running away from your problems, it's running toward a solution." We talked for another hour about practical matters: how to transition my freelance clients, what to do about my lease, whether I should tell my family about my plans before the wedding, or wait until afterward. Jake offered to help with the logistics of moving, despite the fact that my departure would leave him as one of the few people in Cedar Falls who had ever seen my full potential. "You know what the crazy thing is?" I said, as we locked up the store and walked to our cars. "I think they'll be fine without me, maybe even better in some ways, because they won't have to worry about managing my feelings, or finding ways to include me in things I'm supposedly not good enough for." "Maybe," Jake agreed, "but they're going to lose a lot more than they realize, and when they do realize it, you'll be too far away to care." As I drove home through the empty streets of Cedar Falls, past the houses where my classmates were settling into married life and raising children, past the businesses that had watched me grow from a scarred little girl into an invisible young woman, I felt something I'd never experienced before: excitement about my own future. Not hope that my family would finally recognize my worth, not anxiety about whether I was making the right choices to please other people, but genuine anticipation about what I might accomplish when I stopped trying to earn love from people who had already decided I wasn't worth it. The wedding was still 5 weeks away, but I was no longer counting down to Marcus's big day. I was counting down to my own liberation, to the moment when I would finally stop being the invisible daughter and start being the person I was meant to become. Back in my apartment, I opened my laptop and started writing an email to a graphic design agency in Portland that had posted a job listing for a senior designer. I spent 2 hours crafting the perfect cover letter, highlighting my experience and showcasing my best work, imagining what it would feel like to work with people who valued creativity and innovation over family loyalty and social appearances. For the first time in my adult life, I was making plans based on what I wanted rather than what other people needed from me. It felt terrifying and exhilarating, and absolutely right. As I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and found myself really looking at my scar for the first time in years. Instead of the shameful flaw I'd been trained to see, I noticed something different: a mark of courage, a permanent reminder of the day I chose someone else's safety over my own comfort. This scar represented the best part of who I was, the instinct to protect others even at personal cost. My family saw it as an embarrassment to be hidden, but maybe in Portland, someone would see it as evidence of character, proof that I was someone who acted on principle rather than self-interest. Maybe there were people in the world who would value the story behind the scar more than the perfect symmetry of unblemished skin. 5 weeks until the wedding, 5 weeks until I could stop pretending that I belonged in a family that had never wanted me to belong. 5 weeks until I could start building a life where my worth wasn't determined by other people's comfort with my appearance. I fell asleep that night with a smile on my face, dreaming of coffee shops and art galleries, of mountains and forests, of a city where being different was celebrated rather than hidden. In my dreams, I walked down Portland streets with my scar visible, and my head held high, surrounded by people who saw beauty in authenticity rather than perfection in conformity. For the first time in 18 years, I was looking forward to the future instead of trying to fix the past. The weeks before the wedding passed in a strange blur. I documented every instance where my contributions were overlooked, not from spite, but to convince myself I wasn't imagining the pattern. When Mrs. Patterson asked about organic pest control, I spent 20 minutes researching solutions. Linda then repeated my exact advice to her, accepting grateful thanks as if the knowledge was her own. Marcus stopped by one Thursday to discuss timeline details with our parents. After an hour in the office, he mentioned Sarah's family wanted a second photographer for candid moments. We'll have beautiful professional photos and relaxed shots of everyone enjoying themselves, Linda said enthusiastically. Marcus laughed carelessly. Everyone who's actually there anyway. The casual cruelty finally freed me from hope. Instead of pain, I felt relief. That afternoon, I submitted my rental application for a sunny apartment in Portland's Hawthorne district. When I reviewed my freelance income, I realized I was earning almost as much from design work as from the hardware store. I'd been building a legitimate career while trying to prove myself to people who would never see my worth. The wedding photographer visited the store 1 week before the ceremony, praising the garden enhancement I'd coordinated. I always encourage including all family members in formal portraits, he told Linda. These photos become treasured heirlooms, representing family history for future generations. Linda hesitated, glancing toward the office. We've made some adjustments to the photo list. The photographer looked confused. I recommend including all immediate family. People often regret excluding relatives after the fact. His professional advice carried weight my feelings never had. Linda's face showed brief uncertainty before she said firmly, "We've given this a lot of thought. We know what works best for our family." Later, Linda approached me with reluctant uncertainty. "If you wanted to be in some photos, we might be able to arrange something." The offer felt more insulting than the original exclusion. They weren't inviting me because they valued my presence, but because a stranger made them self-conscious. "I think your original plan is better," I said calmly. "I wouldn't want to compromise Sarah's aesthetic." Linda's relief was immediate and visible. "If you're comfortable with that, we'll stick with the original plan." The wedding day arrived with perfect weather. I spent the morning arranging flowers and coordinating details that would make their day flawless. At 11:30, exactly as planned, I left before the photographer arrived. Instead of brooding at home, I spent the afternoon with Jake, discussing my Portland move with genuine excitement. I returned at 6:15 for the reception, seated at a back table with distant relatives. The formal portraits were displayed near the entrance, showcasing the beautiful, unblemished family that remained after my exclusion. Looking at those photos hurt, but there was also peace in seeing the truth documented so clearly. These images were permanent proof that appearance mattered more to them than love. Marcus and Sarah approached near the end, slightly drunk and glowing. "Thank you for everything," Sarah said. "The garden area was stunning in our photos. You have such an eye for detail." They thanked me for essential contributions while remaining oblivious to excluding me from permanent memories. I was valuable only as an invisible facilitator, not as family worthy of inclusion. I said goodbye to everyone, knowing these were farewell embraces they didn't recognize. 2 weeks later, I loaded my belongings into a moving truck and drove west. With each mile toward Portland, I felt lighter, shedding years of disappointment. My Hawthorne apartment was bright and spacious, in a neighborhood that valued authenticity over perfection. Within a month, my freelance business flourished. I joined a hiking group that met weekends to explore Mount Hood trails. I found a coffee shop called Grind, owned by Maria Santos, who had also escaped toxic family dynamics. People here understand that interesting lives leave marks. Maria said one morning, "Your scar tells a story about who you are. That's beautiful." For the first time, I was surrounded by people who saw my scar as evidence of character rather than a flaw. 6 months later, Marcus sent Facebook photos from their Italian honeymoon, writing, "Hope you're doing well. These photos turned out great, don't you think?" I deleted the message without responding and blocked him. I was no longer available to admire their perfection from the sidelines. A year later, Jake visited Portland, marveling at my transformation. The hardware store was struggling again without my expertise. "Do you ever think about going back?" he asked. "I think about the people they might have been," I said. "But those people don't exist. The real versions of my family made their choices, and I've made mine." 2 years after leaving, I opened my own design studio with 3 employees and 60 people at the grand opening. Maria gave a toast. "Emma had the courage to choose authenticity over acceptance. She's proof that sometimes the best thing you can do is find people who see your worth clearly." Late that night, I thought about those wedding photos displayed in Marcus's home. In contrast, my studio walls showed authentic connections with people who valued my complete self. 3 years later, Linda sent a letter through Jake, detailing financial struggles and requesting I help save the hardware store again. The wedding was mentioned as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by my sensitivity. There was no real apology, no acknowledgement of pain caused. The letter was a business proposal in familial language, attempting to reclaim my utility without addressing deeper issues. I filed it away without responding. They had taught me my worth was conditional, based on what I could provide rather than who I was. That weekend, I attended a friend's wedding that emphasized authenticity over perfection. The photos showed genuine emotion and real connection. I danced freely, my scar visible and unremarkable among people who valued character over appearance. These were the kind of photos worth keeping, documenting moments where everyone present was wanted completely. 4 years after leaving Cedar Falls, my design studio had expanded to 7 employees and occupied a renovated warehouse space in Portland's Arts District. We specialized in purpose-driven branding, working with nonprofits, sustainable businesses, and social enterprises that wanted their visual identity to reflect their values. The work was challenging and meaningful, exactly what I'd dreamed of creating when I first started freelancing in my tiny apartment above the Cedar Falls pharmacy. One autumn morning, Maria stopped by the studio with coffee and news that made her eyes bright with excitement. "You'll never guess who called me yesterday. A documentary filmmaker from Seattle wants to do a piece on small business owners who reinvented themselves after leaving toxic situations. I immediately thought of you." The documentary project intrigued me, not because I wanted to broadcast my family's dysfunction, but because I recognized how many people might benefit from hearing that choosing yourself over family obligation wasn't selfish, it was survival. The filmmaker, a woman named Emma Chen, ironically sharing my last name, interviewed me for 3 hours about my journey from invisible daughter to independent entrepreneur. "What strikes me most about your story," Rebecca said as we wrapped up filming, "is how you transformed rejection into fuel for building something remarkable. Most people would have stayed stuck in bitterness, but you used that pain as motivation to create the life you actually wanted." Her observation made me realize something profound. I hadn't spent the past 4 years dwelling on what my family had done to me. Instead, I'd invested that energy into building relationships with people who saw my full humanity, developing skills that challenged me creatively, and contributing to a community that valued authentic connection over superficial perfection. The documentary aired 6 months later on a regional public television network, generating unaccepted attention for my studio. Former clients reached out to express their appreciation for my work. New potential customers contacted me specifically because they connected with my story of resilience and reinvention. But the most surprising response came from an email address I didn't recognize, with a subject line that made my stomach tighten. From your brother. Marcus had watched the documentary at the recommendation of his therapist, who he was seeing to address what he described as ongoing marital difficulties and family relationship issues. His email was longer and more introspective than any communication I'd received from him in my entire life. He wrote about watching the documentary with Sarah, seeing their wedding discussed as the catalyst for my departure, and recognizing for the first time how their actions must have felt from my perspective. He admitted that the marriage he'd been so determined to photograph perfectly had been struggling for years, partly because the same superficial values that led them to exclude me from photos had created a relationship focused on appearances rather than genuine partnership. I've been in therapy for 8 months now, Marcus wrote, working through why I prioritized other people's opinions over my relationship with my sister. My therapist asked me a question that I haven't been able to stop thinking about: if I could go back to the wedding day, would I choose differently? The honest answer is that I want to believe I would, but I'm not sure I had the courage then that you showed by walking away. He didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation. Instead, he simply acknowledged that he understood now what he'd been too self-absorbed to see before, that excluding me from his wedding wasn't a practical compromise, it was a fundamental betrayal of family loyalty that revealed his own insecurity and moral weakness. I read the email multiple times, processing emotions I'd thought were fully resolved. There was satisfaction in having my experience validated by the person who had hurt me most directly. There was also sadness for the relationship we might have had if he'd possessed this self-awareness years earlier. But mostly, I felt a quiet certainty that his belated understanding didn't change my decision or diminish the life I'd built without him. I wrote back briefly, thanking him for his honesty and wishing him well in his continued personal growth. I didn't offer to resume regular contact or suggest visiting Cedar Falls. Some bridges, once burned, reveal that they were leading to places you never needed to go. 5 years after the wedding, I received news through Jake that Chen's Hardware had finally closed permanently, sold to a development company that planned to demolish the building for condos. Linda and Robert had retired to a modest apartment in a nearby town, living on Social Security and the small proceeds from the business sale. The store that had defined their identity and consumed their energy for decades was gone, replaced by generic housing that would eventually be filled with young professionals who would never know a hardware store had once stood there. I felt a strange mix of emotions hearing this news. There was no satisfaction in their loss, no sense of vindication that the business had failed without my contributions. Instead, I felt a kind of melancholy for what might have been if they'd valued relationships as much as they valued appearances, if they'd invested in their daughter's potential as enthusiastically as they'd invested in maintaining their image. That evening, I walked through my Portland neighborhood as autumn leaves scattered across the sidewalks and the first hints of winter appeared on Mount Hood's distant peaks. I passed coffee shops where I knew the baristas by name, bookstores where staff recommended titles based on my interests, galleries featuring work by artists I'd met through community events. This neighborhood had become home in ways Cedar Falls never was, not because it was objectively better, but because I was valued here as a complete person, rather than a useful tool or embarrassing liability. My phone buzzed with a text from Maria inviting me to dinner at her place with several other local business owners. These casual gatherings had become regular occurrences, opportunities to share challenges and celebrate successes with people who understood the complex reality of building something meaningful from scratch. I accepted immediately, grateful for friendships that required no performance or pretense. At dinner that night, surrounded by people whose presence in my life was chosen rather than obligated, I shared the news about the hardware store closing. The group listened with the kind of engaged attention that suggested they understood what the loss represented beyond simple business failure. "Do you wish you'd stayed to help them?" asked Thomas, who owned a sustainable clothing boutique and had his own complicated family history, "or that you'd tried harder to make them understand your value?" I considered the question carefully, thinking about all the alternate versions of my life that might have existed if I'd made different choices. I used to think I wanted them to recognize what I'd contributed and apologize for how they treated me. But what I actually needed was to recognize my own worth independent of their acknowledgement. Leaving wasn't about punishing them, it was about refusing to keep diminishing myself to fit into their narrow vision of who I should be. The conversation shifted to other topics, but later that night, as I walked home through quiet streets, I found myself thinking about the young woman I'd been 5 years earlier. She had believed that if she just worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, proved herself sufficiently, her family would eventually see her value. She had measured her worth by their approval and found herself constantly falling short of arbitrary standards. The woman I'd become understood something fundamental that the younger version hadn't grasped: you cannot earn love from people who have decided you're not worth loving fully. You can only choose to invest your energy in relationships where your humanity is recognized without audition or apology. My scar would always mark me as someone who had chosen instinctive courage over calculated safety when I was 8 years old. But the real courage came 18 years later, when I chose my own well-being over family obligation, when I decided that being excluded from their perfect photos was less painful than spending a lifetime trying to Photoshop myself into their acceptance. As I unlocked my apartment door and looked around at the space I'd created for myself, filled with art from local makers and photographs of genuine moments with people who chose to include me completely, I felt profound gratitude for the rejection that had ultimately freed me. Sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is showing you clearly that you deserve better than what they're offering. 6 years after leaving Cedar Falls, I was invited to speak at a design conference in Seattle about building authentic brands for mission-driven companies. The auditorium held 300 people, mostly young designers and entrepreneurs, who were trying to navigate the tension between commercial success and personal integrity. Standing on that stage, looking out at faces eager to learn from my experience, I realized how far I'd traveled from the woman who had once measured her worth by her family's approval. During the question and answer session, a young woman in the front row raised her hand tentatively. "Your story about leaving your family has really resonated with me," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "But how did you deal with the guilt? I'm in a similar situation with my parents, and every time I think about setting boundaries, I feel like I'm being selfish or ungrateful." The question brought me back to those early months in Portland, when I'd second-guessed my decision constantly, when every holiday or family milestone triggered waves of doubt about whether I'd overreacted or been too harsh. "The guilt never completely disappears," I told her honestly. "But over time, you learn to distinguish between legitimate guilt about causing harm and manufactured guilt designed to keep you compliant. Ask yourself, would you treat someone you loved the way they're treating you? If the answer is no, then you're not being selfish by expecting better." After the conference, several attendees approached me with similar stories of family estrangement, toxic relationships, and the difficult process of choosing self-preservation over obligation. One man in his 40s told me he'd been no contact with his parents for 15 years after they'd disowned him for being gay. A woman in her 30s described leaving her hometown after her family consistently prioritized her successful siblings over her artistic pursuits. Each story was unique in its details, but familiar in its emotional architecture: the pattern of devaluation, the moment of recognition, the painful but necessary decision to walk away. These conversations reminded me that my experience wasn't exceptional or unusual. Thousands of people faced similar choices every day, weighing the cost of maintaining toxic relationships against the freedom of building lives aligned with their authentic selves. The difference was that most of these struggles remained private, hidden behind the social expectation that family loyalty should trump personal well-being. On the flight back to Portland, I drafted an essay about the wedding photo incident and its aftermath. Writing had become a form of processing for me over the years, a way to transform personal pain into something that might help others navigate similar challenges. The essay explored the specific dynamics of appearance-based discrimination within families, the way physical differences became convenient excuses for deeper patterns of favoritism and exclusion. I submitted the essay to a national magazine that focused on family relationships and personal growth. 3 weeks later, they accepted it for publication, with an editor noting that the piece captured something essential about the hidden costs of pursuing perfection at the expense of authentic connection. When the essay appeared 2 months later, my inbox flooded with messages from readers who recognized their own experiences in my story. One email particularly moved me, from a woman named Jennifer, whose teenage daughter had severe acne scarring. Jennifer wrote that her extended family had been pressuring her to exclude her daughter from family photos until her skin cleared up, suggesting they could Photoshop her into pictures later. Reading my essay had given Jennifer the courage to refuse these requests and to affirm her daughter's right to be present and visible regardless of her appearance. Your story helped me understand that agreeing to hide my daughter would teach her that her worth is conditional on meeting other people's aesthetic standards, Jennifer wrote. Instead, I told my family that if they couldn't accept her exactly as she is, we wouldn't be attending future gatherings. It was the hardest conversation I've ever had, but also the most important. Thank you for showing me what it looks like to choose dignity over acceptance. Reading Jennifer's email brought tears to my eyes, not just because my story had helped her make a difficult decision, but because it represented the kind of parental protection I'd never received. Her daughter would grow up, knowing that her mother valued her humanity more than perfect pictures, that she was worth defending even when that defense came at social cost. That knowledge would shape her sense of self-worth in ways that would ripple through her entire life. The essay's publication led to unexpected opportunities. A publisher contacted me about writing a book exploring the broader themes of family estrangement and self-advocacy. A podcast focused on personal development invited me to discuss the process of building identity separate from family expectations. A university's design program asked me to teach a semester course on ethical branding and authentic visual communication. Each of these opportunities represented validation that my experience had value beyond my personal healing, that the pain I'd endured could be transformed into something useful for others facing similar struggles. But they also reminded me how much my life had expanded since leaving Cedar Falls, how many possibilities had opened up once I stopped contorting myself to fit into spaces that were never designed to accommodate my full humanity. 7 years after the wedding, I flew to Iowa to attend Jake's wedding. He'd met someone remarkable, a teacher named Andrea, who shared his commitment to community service and his capacity for genuine friendship. The ceremony was held in a renovated barn outside Cedar Falls, intimate and joyful, with vows that emphasized partnership and mutual growth rather than perfect appearances. During the reception, several people from my past approached me with careful curiosity. Former customers from the hardware store told me they'd heard about my success in Portland and were impressed by how far I'd come. High school classmates who had barely acknowledged me when we were teenagers now wanted to hear about my design studio and my speaking engagements. Their interest felt hollow, rooted more in my accomplishments than in any genuine care for my well-being, but I engaged politely and kept conversations brief. What I didn't do was visit my parents or reach out to Marcus, even though I knew they still lived within 20 miles of the venue. That door had closed years ago, and I had no interest in reopening it for the sake of social convention or nostalgic curiosity. Some relationships, once ended, should remain finished. Jake's wedding photos, which he shared with me a month later, showed something my brother's wedding portraits never could: authentic joy captured in moments of genuine connection. There were imperfect shots of people laughing mid-sentence, candid images of guests dancing awkwardly, pictures that documented real emotion rather than staged perfection. My scar was visible in several group photos, unremarkable among the diverse faces of people Jake and Andrea loved enough to include completely. Looking at those photos, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with vindication or revenge. These images represented what wedding photography should be: documentation of community, celebration of commitment, evidence of love that included rather than excluded. They would serve as reminders not of who looked best, but of who showed up, who cared enough to witness and celebrate an important milestone. As I prepared for bed that night, in my Portland apartment, I thought about the two weddings and what they represented. Marcus's ceremony had been designed to project an image of perfection, carefully curated to exclude anything that might complicate the visual narrative. Jake's celebration had embraced the messy reality of human connection, finding beauty in authenticity rather than in artificial perfection. One wedding had required my absence to succeed. The other had been enriched by my presence. The difference between those two experiences captured everything I'd learned about worth and belonging over the past 7 years. You don't find your place by making yourself smaller to fit into spaces that reject you. You find it by building or discovering communities that recognize your value without requiring you to audition for acceptance. My journey from invisible daughter to independent entrepreneur had taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from people who make your presence conditional. It had shown me that chosen family often provides the unconditional acceptance that biological family promises but fails to deliver. Most importantly, it had proven that the courage to choose yourself, even when that choice looks like selfishness to people invested in your compliance, can lead to a life more authentic and fulfilling than anything you could build on a foundation of other people's approval. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.